We hear a lot of talk today about issues that are out of this world, such as UFOs. Do Sasquatches exist? Now, of course, that's here on planet Earth, here in the Northwest. We actually talk a great deal about the Bigfoot phenomenon, and there are celebrations and picnics and all types of museum displays. But we are on a particular kick right now in our culture where we deal with the subjective. We don't deal with the objective. We don't demand proof of statements that are made by even some experts. And I really think part of this is due to the fact we want to be mesmerized. We want to go for the sensational in nature. Now, does that mean there are not UFOs? Well, not necessarily. It means you've got to be very careful about what you accept as proof. Now, I realize even that can be a subjective notion. Now, let's talk about proof for just a moment. I can say, well, Alexander Suchin or Graham Hancock seem to say the Sphinx of Egypt is old and it goes back to the Anunnaki periods when so-called UFO aliens came down here and took over and, planted a civilization here on Earth. Just because you may write a 400-page book about it, number one, does not mean that the Anunnaki documents actually make such statements. It doesn't mean the people writing the books actually are qualified to make such assessments. Now, you can get the Anunnaki text out there. I certainly quoted them in my PhD dissertation, From Sacral Kingship to Sacred Marriage, to show the enthronement rights that the gods had when you made your way up the mountain and ratified it through supper, meaning a covenant. And then, of course, you came back down the mountain as Moses did to share it with the congregation, and of course, they ratified it as a community. But be that as it may, the Anunnaki documents themselves actually say nothing, zero, right off, white out, do whatever you want to do with it about aliens ascending from the gods. Now, there was a book many, many years ago, Chariots of the Gods, that raised quite a bit of stir out there, and of course that was a precursor to these other publications of which I'm speaking. Then, of course, we can say, well, what about Roswell? Well, what about the UFO that was found with USA on the side of it? But then we have to be very careful also, not only what was kept in a U.S. government warehouse, but the claims that the aliens they saw were balloon-type figures, which were made in the late 40s to distract the Soviet Union, which has also proven to have some validity to it. So we need to divide truth from error. And there are many parts of these situations we will never know the bottom line to. We do know the U.S. Air Force doesn't want to tell us what they have in their files. but the government doesn't want us to know many things about a lot of its activities. It doesn't prove that they are holding alien evidence from us. Now, maybe they are, maybe they're not. You see, it depends on which side of the coin you err on. Now, President Johnson, I guess there's some buzz out there on the internet, which suggests that President Johnson feared such a thing. But see, once again, the people who encapsulate and recontext these statements from well-known people are not here to say, well, here's what I meant, here was the discussion, here was the context. Once you're dead, well, people can say anything and recast any evidence. It may be true, it may be not true. You can't prove it either way. Now, what about the statements of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and many other astronauts who said we were followed when we went around the moon? Or I can't talk about that because I have an oath and I need to keep this secret. Now, once again, how do you prove a negative, you see? And then how do you explain alien abductions? Well, is that what they are? It's interesting how this phenomenon since the mid-60s, and obviously before then to Roswell and other periods, have been gaining, though, more psychological momentum than with the movies, E.T. and all the rest of this. You know, sociological phenomenon just keeps growing by leaps and bounds until, currently more Americans believe in UFO abductions than believe in a literal return of our Lord Jesus Christ to this world to rule it with a rod of iron and to bring peace and healing to all nations. Have we lost that much reality? One could ask. The polls indicate 77% of Americans believe in UFOs. But remember, let's define what is a UFO, an unidentified flying object. Therefore, we need to leave it there until we have proven otherwise. What about the ancient caves and pictographs that, have flying saucers on them? Well, once again, we need to be able to positively decode them, which we're still at the point of guesswork at this point in time. So there's a great deal of fantasy that is being applied from our movie culture back into some of these publications. So watch out. Even major talk shows have built their reputation on stories like this, heard nightly on nighttime radio. And when you email them and you tell them, look, I'm a PhD, I use the Anunnaki documents in my dissertation, I'd like to provide an alternative view, you never hear a reply. So it's what sells. It is not necessarily what is true or objective. Now, what about the Bigfoot phenomenon? Here in the state of Idaho, that is a hot topic. The state university has one of the leading scholars who is studying the DNA, the bone fragments, and the claims of others in the area of anthropology, and obviously other types of geno projects. And what they have basically said is there are some unknown strands that are out there of hair. And we here talk about DNA samples, but none have really come to light yet. The Russian army definitely has made such a claim that a furry ape monster type cross between humanoids and animals have definitely been photographed, but the DNA samples, of course, were contaminated. So once again, back in 1967, Roger Patterson from my father's hometown, who was well known to my family, produced a book called Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist? Now, once again, what do you do with this? The Yakima Herald Republic later published a claim that the Patterson film, as they call it, taken place in Northern California, where 18 seconds of, a Bigfoot was shown. Now, people have analyzed that more than any other footage, with the exception of the Zapruder film of the assassination of John Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. And, we've heard all kinds of statements about a man who claims, well, he wanted to pay me, Roger Patterson, $1,500 to go up there in an ape-like suit. Now, once again, the Yakima Herald Republic newspaper ran the story, but it really doesn't prove or disprove, number one, if that was the case. And now there's been a retraction. And we really can't prove how authentic, even though it looks impressive, the actual original film is. It's like the John Kennedy assassination. I've got many, many, many documentaries on that and many books. Once again, we know something's rotten in Denmark because of the lack of credibility of the Warren Commission. But what happened in reality? What was the real story? Some people feel that Castro responded through his connections in New Orleans. Some feel due to the threats against Kennedy made by the mob and the connections of David Ferrie with Jack Ruby, that proves the mob was involved because of Ruby's going in and out of the police station in Dallas for almost a whole day before Jack Ruby was knocked off. Yes, there is something rotten in Denmark, and we need to be aware and fearless about the conclusions in which we come to once we have carefully evaluated the evidence. And once again, on stories like this, the conclusive evidence, even though there's compelling evidence out there by Mark Lane, who was a press agent for Kennedy during his administration, and best kept evidence has given us very good evidence about the newspapers and some breadth about this story that has not been covered elsewhere. So, once again, use common sense, require documentation before you buy a concept, and then study to see what evidence is there against it before you come to your conclusion. This is Father Tom Roberts saying thank you for listening.